Whether it's the Jetsons or Peripheral, there's a reason we love futurist TV shows. They're just realistic enough to be creepy and just far out there enough for it to be just entertainment. But while showrunners and writers seem to have a peek into the future of what's next, lawmakers are arguing about TikTok. This modern mismatch can produce more than just a collection of internet memes. It can have real ethical implications, especially in the area of neurotechnology, brain-computer interfacing for the hacking and tracking of our brains. My next guest is at the intersection of technology, civil liberties, and human rights. Her PhD is in the social impacts of technology with a focus on surveillance and privacy in areas like workplace surveillance, health information privacy, and AI regulation. She's currently the acting executive director of the Master in Public Policy and Digital Society program at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. And today, she's going to get us up to speed on the current and potential uses of neurotech and help us explore the question, is neurotech an ethical disaster waiting to happen? Privacy advocate, researcher, all-around bookworm, Dr. Brenda McPhail. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is a great topic. It'll be a fun conversation.
I think it's a great topic too, but it's also a difficult topic for those of us who drank out of a water hose growing up, you know?
I'm with you.
So, and since I do tend to be a negative Nancy about these types of things, I was hoping that we could kick things off by you bringing balance into the equation by sharing some positive ways that neurotechnology is currently in use for.
Sure, and that's a great way to start. Particularly the place where there are positive applications of neurotechnology is in the medical field. Really, what neurotechnology tries to do is augment the activity of our nervous system and expand our capabilities. So when you listen to that sort of vaguely technical definition, you can probably start to imagine in a medical context how this technology could be useful. So for example, if your brain could help control a piece of technology, that's beneficial to those who are paralyzed. You could open up a whole new world for people who can't use their limbs to navigate through the world if they could do it with their brain, whether that's as simple as using a prosthetic device to press an elevator button or to control a wheelchair, or whether it's more complicated, like using mechanical legs to move around or actually manipulating your very own arm. With the help of a prosthetic device. The other ways that in the medical field there's the potential for really positive results from this is when it comes to supports for people who either have mental impairments or mental health issues. So for all of those people, and there are millions of people around the world suffering from degenerative brain diseases, like dementia and Alzheimer's. There's the potential for this kind of technology to help not just better understand what's happening in their brains, but also help create new kinds of treatment and new kinds of coping mechanisms for people who are experiencing those diseases. The same thing goes for other kinds of mental illness. There's very promising studies about using techniques related to neurotechnology to help people, to get at the root causes of what's wrong in your brain that is causing a mental illness to develop and to manifest itself in your life. So there's, exciting medical potential for some of the uses of these technologies.
And when you talk about mental impairments, are you referring to people who are nonverbal?
Yes. There are different kinds of ways that this technology could be used, but one is to assist someone to use their brain to convey to speak, essentially.
Yeah.
To use a device that will help them speak.
Like Stephen Hawking had a device, but I think his was, in the beginning at least, I heard it was 1 word per minute or something like this. So this would be a much more advanced version of that. But it's interesting when we talk about people who are nonverbal, whether that is a condition that they've had their whole life, like in some versions of autism, or if it's a more acute scenario, like someone who's in a coma. And that sort of brings up the question. I know we're just like diving right into it, but it brings up the question of consciousness, right? Like this would change the way scientists view consciousness. I interviewed Dr. Bruce Grayson, who studies near-death experiences, and that is the topic of his focus for his study. And it makes me wonder how that would just fundamentally change what we register as life and not life. You know what I mean?
If we could develop technologies that would allow those who are in a coma to speak, absolutely. That would change the nature of our understanding of what it means to be in a coma, first of
Yeah.
all, as well as the medical understanding of what that state is, as well as if we change the understanding of what is consciousness and what constitutes being human and having human autonomy. Is communication enough? Is communication part of the question?
Yeah.
Does it matter if we can't move? I think a lot of people who, suffer from injuries or a lack of ability to move would say, of course, it's not about movement in a physical sense, but then is it about being able to exert your will into the world in ways that are understandable and visible to others? If technology could allow people who are unable to do that with their minds,
Yeah. I mean, we're talking
who
about
can't do that with their
autonomy.
bodies.
No, yeah, we're talking about autonomy and consent, right? Because think about nursing home abuses. It would change the way elder care happens, right? Hopefully, it would improve for the better. And in Canada, where you're at, it'd be interesting because you have the C-14 law where people can choose medically induced death. And so, if they are suffering, they now would have the ability to communicate that and say, "Please, I choose to end my life." So medically, I could definitely see how it could be used in the future. And as you stated, it's already being used for in medical ways. So there's positive applications there. However, the dark cloud over us and the dark cloud that you venture into on a daily basis is the more dicey areas of neurotechnology application. In China, this was back in 2014, the government started to implement policies for some of their government employees to have to wear neuro headbands while they're working to scan their brain waves for anxiety, rage, and fatigue. And then, strangely, that same year, 2014, the Florida State Police signed a contract to work with a brain fingerprinting company called Brainwave Science, which was hailed as like the next level lie detector, and it was going to end torture interrogation, which I like the idea of ending torture interrogation. However, both of these things are definitely giving me vibes from that movie Minority Report, where people were arrested for their thought crimes. So, how do you, are running these scenarios extreme, or is it important for us to go down these rabbit trails of what ifs?
It is absolutely fundamentally important for us to think about the what ifs. And I wouldn't even characterize them as rabbit trails because if you look around, like a quick Google search on neurotechnology, for example, will come up with exactly the kinds of ideas that you're talking about. In a criminal context, there are people who think it would be super awesome to be able to put a machine on someone who's been accused of a crime and find out if they did it. It's not speculation that people would want to do that. There are people out there right now trying to figure out ways to do it. And your high-tech mental fingerprinting company is just the tip of the iceberg. And the other thing we know is anything that's being sort of marketed in a commercial setting in that regard has probably already been tested and studied, and in some way is being implemented in a military or a secret service kind of context. So at the point that it becomes a commercial product, you can be pretty much guaranteed that the research is already well underway in other contexts outside the commercial. So that's a little piece of the puzzle as well that we have to take into account.
Yes, it is. I think it's important for the general public to take that piece of the puzzle in account because it makes it real. Because there is the temptation as the average Joe or Jane to go, oh, that's so far away. I don't have to worry about that. But as you said, if we're seeing these sorts of technologies available in the commercial public marketplace, then that means they've been used militarily, most likely already for a while. And when you said research, like the research has been done, the research is happening now, definitely the research for the advancement of the technology to use the technology, but who is doing the research for the ethics of that? Are there standardized ethical protocols that you would go through with a technology like this, just as you would like an FDA drug approval?
So there is nothing as well established as an FDA drug approval for this.
That's horrifying.
But there needs to be.
Yeah.
And that is not to say that this field operates entirely without ethics. So in the sort of mainstream academic research world where this is a hot topic, because as we started out with at the beginning, there are some potentially really profoundly beneficial uses to this technology that could solve really profound human problems. There are also ethicists, bioethicists, legal scholars, and civil society folk like me who are thinking about this. There are also governments who are thinking about this. And in fact, in Chile, they have the very first law that is meant to protect neural rights in the face of the development of this technology. So as the technologies are being explored, the thinking about what could be good and what could go wrong and where are the potential harms, and if we think that these tools or some of these tools, some subset of these tools have the potential to be so beneficial that we should continue with the exploration of what it means to get inside people's brains for purposes, whether it's for purposes of treatment, which we've been talking about, or whether it's for military purposes that we've mentioned, or whether it's even for something more trivial like marketing purposes. And there's a big school of thought that thinks it would be a really great idea to figure out how to control people's minds in order to further commercial prospects for a company. As all of those sort of lines of research are proceeding, there is a corresponding line of thinking that's happening about, what kinds of frameworks do we need to put in place to keep people safe if we allow research to proceed along these lines? Are there any potential uses of this technology that are just so profoundly dangerous that maybe it should be a no-go zone? And there's pros and cons to that kind of thinking. I was listening to one of your early episodes recently where you talked to a scholar who studied curse words and swearing. And he made a brilliant point that as soon as you tell young people not to do something, it makes them want to do it more. The conversation there was around, how's that whole abstinence thing been working out?
Yeah.
But in this context as well, when it comes to technological development, telling a certain kind of experimenter, no, you shouldn't do that because it's dangerous, is only going to drive them forward and make them more determined to prove the naysayers wrong, to move their research and their visions forward. But there is a legal role for saying, look, something is just too dangerous to try it. Let's have a no-go zone around that. And then, in addition to what's the legal framework, and should there ever be anything we just never allow? There's the question of what kind of impact on existing rights and freedoms does this technology have the potential to have? And do we need to start thinking about instituting into our national laws or international covenants new kinds of rights that sort of speak to the risks that this technology raises? Can we, at a really fundamental level, think through, if we're going to allow these kinds of developments to proceed, if we're going to allow technologies that try to get into our minds and either change the way we think or change the way we can use our bodies, or allow others to see how we think, or potentially allow others to affect how we use our bodies. What are the ground rules for that? What are the rights that are affected, and how can we think about them in concrete enough ways that once we've recognized the rights, we can pass the right laws to protect them?
Yeah, I could almost envision a committee for specific technologies being a more efficient methodology for ethical approval than a set of vaguely worded laws by which researchers and companies, tech companies with their, team of lawyers can work around and find loopholes for. Can you tell me anything specifically about the Chile legislation, how it's worded, or what it specifically allows and disallows?
Yeah, so the Chilean law goes through that process of thinking through what are the fundamental kinds of rights that people already have that we believe are important, and what are the new rights or the extensions of existing rights that we're going to need in order to make sure that we have the right kind of protections. And also to make sure, in the Chilean context, the other thing they wanted to do is make sure that people had access to the kinds of technologies that would benefit them, that they would want to have access to. So it wasn't just about how do we constrain the use of this technology. It was also about how do we facilitate the use of this technology in ways that are going to be socially responsible.
Yeah, that's interesting that it's more about protecting the rights than limiting the tech, because there's this aspect, a really big aspect of consent, right? Because we don't even know what we're consenting to really when we download an app. Those terms and conditions change all the time. I know there was a couple years ago, I did an episode with Josh and September Dye about this sort of thing. And there was legislation then, I think it was 2020, about some California legislation trying to make things easier to understand so that people who use apps truly understand what it is they're consenting to. But speaking of apps, Meta acquired a neural interface startup called Control Labs, specifically to get its mind-reading wristband. It was a $500,000 deal, and they announced that in early 2025, so just around the corner, they will be launching their neuro interface watch together with AR, augmented reality, and it will be like a control stick for everything. You can type and swipe and all without moving, which I'm like, oh, that's really what we need, more inactivity. See, I'm so negative. I'm so negative about this stuff. But upgrading your Apple Watch from monitoring your heart rate to monitoring your brain waves will be a real thing. And it can infer mood, what turns you on. It could infer our political affiliations based on our neural reactions when seeing an ad for one candidate or another. I mean, this is a lot. How do we navigate who owns the data when our laws, at least in the US, don't even protect the data ownership of those genetic tests that we all like to do to find out how much white we are? Oh, I'm Irish white. Oh, I'm English white. Like those ones. How do we even begin to navigate that when the laws haven't even caught up to those?
It's hard. Part of the solution is we need to look at existing laws to see what kind of protections we have. And part of the solution is creating new laws. And for all of that, we need to be really bold about thinking about, the potentials of the technology. Some people, when you're a critic of technology, sometimes people say that you're a Luddite, that you're excessively negative. I mean, you've sort of doubled down and claimed your negativity. I always think of myself as a tech optimist and a human pessimist.
Oh, okay.
I think that technology can be designed to do amazing, cool things. People are bound to screw it up unless we're not really careful. So, when it comes to this, you asked earlier what the Chilean law did, what kind of new rights there are, and when it comes to neurotechnology, we need to build on our existing privacy laws. And privacy is recognized as a fundamental human right. It's enshrined in the UN declarations around rights that the majority of countries around the world have subscribed to. And we need to extend that to mental privacy. We need to think about privacy not just as our ability to be let alone or to negotiate secrets between one another, but also the rights to control who gets into our head and to control the functioning of our brains. And that's part of a larger concept that in the Chilean law, they talk about cognitive liberty. So in a democracy, we believe in the concept of liberty as the ability to sort of go about our daily lives free from undue restriction by the state or by the private sector. If we believe that's important for our bodies, it is equally, if not more important for our minds. So we need to start thinking about cognitive liberty as a fundamental human right. Along with that cognitive liberty then goes the concept of mental integrity, where we get to decide not just what we think and how we feel about things, and it's our processing of those things that needs to matter, but also who gets to plug what into our head.
Yeah.
And when they get to do that. And that goes back to your conversations about consent. And you're absolutely right. If we don't understand what we're doing when we click yes to download that bubble popping app, and behind the scenes there's a data broker that signed a contract with that game company to scan your friends list and take a look at your photos because it's asked for access to your camera. If we don't understand those relatively minor things that we already do, how are we going to understand what somebody might want to do to influence our thought patterns and ultimately our behavior through those thought patterns?
How can
But we have to figure it out.
We do have to figure out, but it's difficult, and we live in a very fast-paced society where we value highly convenience. We value, to some extent, targeted ads. I remember a few years ago, friends and I were having a party, and it was 90s neon themed. It was when you couldn't as easily find neon things. Now they're easier to find. And it was so hard to find a 90s neon leopard print bikini. I realize that's a tall ask, right? But I really wanted this specific thing. And all I had to do was use the Chrome browser and the Google search engine to type that in once, and I mean, later that same day, I was served up ads on Facebook that allowed me to find the perfect leopard print neon bikini. So I thought, oh, okay, that's kind of nice, right? Now I have a different relationship with that sort of interaction, but what do you say to, the average citizen who might respond to some of your prompts in a way that's like, well, I like those ads. They're helpful and I have nothing to hide. So if you need to track me, especially for national security, then so be it. No big deal. This is the world we live in. Shrug, shrug.
That whole, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear line has been around for a really, really long time. And it has never been less true than it is now. And it will only continue becoming less and less true. Because it doesn't matter what you think you might have to hide. It doesn't matter what you think you don't need to hide. Your understanding of who you are and how you move about in the world is only peripherally connected at this point to the digital versions of you out there,
Mm-hmm.
and the kinds of inferences that people are making about who you are and what you think and how you're going to behave with any particular stimuli. Already, leaving aside neurotech, just talking about plain old behavioral advertising and behavioral, data analytics that allow for behavioral understandings. The inferences that are going to be made about you based on that information have the potential to have consequential impacts on your life, whether you think there's anything bad that anyone could find out about you or not. Because you might think, I have made every mortgage payment on time all of my life. And so anybody who looks at my credit score is going to think, wow, she's awesome. She is absolutely a fantastic risk, and we are going to give her all our money if she wants it. And what you might not know is that the algorithm behind the scenes on the loan decision-making software is looking at that as, 50% of the weighting of what they think about you. And then they might look at things like, who does she associate with? Are any of her known associates not just connected to activity that we think is shady, but are they connected within a certain degree of separation to anyone else that's been involved in behavior that we think is shady? What is her social network, and what does that, and then, how do we want to rate that into the credit score? What kind of education does she have? Yeah, she's making her payments, but, we know certain things about the risk level of people at different levels of education. So we're going to weight that into how many kids are there? Is there a family pet? What's her postal code? Who are her neighbors? What is the historical likelihood that people in that postal code with those kind of neighbors, who have that kind of associates, who have that kind of credit rating, are going to go on to default on their loan? And those are just, like a handful of data points that might go into weighing that algorithm. The reality is that a lot of the algorithms will toss in a couple hundred, maybe more data points in that kind of decision process. So at that point, it's not about what you think you have to hide. It's about, what are other people going to make up based on data that's out there that you may or may not know is out there, that may or may not be accurate, based on algorithms and data science that may or may not be valid. Some of the science out there looking at, how people are going to behave based on whether they're tired or not, or whether they're stressed or not, or whether they're smiling or not, or whether all of that sort of affect type science, some of it is junk. And some of it is valid, and some of it is real. And is the company that's making a decision about you using the good stuff or the bad stuff? And how do you know? And how do you challenge it if you do come to know? All of that sort of complexity behind the ways that data and technologies are being used to make decisions about you means that it's entirely irrelevant if you think you have something to hide. It's all about what somebody else can infer about you based on whatever they think they know.
Yeah, that inference piece is sketchy. Could this kind of technology implant thoughts that are not native to the thinker?
That's another question about neurotechnology, and a great way to drag us back onto the topic, because I went a little bit off. But yes, that is one of the concerns. The right to psychological continuity is another right that's tied up with neurotechnology and neuroscience. The right to sort of have the integrity of your thoughts and the continuity of your thoughts and who you are evolve evolve naturally and in the direction that you choose. And there's a real risk with this kind of technology at the extreme edges of what we'd consider, dangerous or problematic, that, somebody might try to manipulate that. And it could be done for reasons that sound socially acceptable.
Right.
A lot of times when we're implementing new technologies that are, that kind of make you clench, make you go, ooh, I don't know, maybe there's a creepy aspect to that. The justifications, the creepier the initial, the more that a person might have that initial clench reaction, the more of the justifications tend to be made in ways that are almost unquestionable. So, should we break encryption that provides security to everybody on the internet for every transaction and every piece of communication they do? Well, it would help us catch the bad guys who exploit children. You can't be against catching the bad guys who exploit children, can you? And with this kind of technology, it would be, well, if we could find out the thoughts of a serial killer before he or she commits their terrible crime, that would be of immense benefit to humanity. And if we could not just detect the thoughts of that serial killer, but if we could then put them through a rehabilitation program by manipulating the way that they think in order to stop them from wanting to
Yeah.
kill anybody ever, like wouldn't the world be a better place if we could just put everybody who has any potential to do any harm through a process of rehabilitation to make sure that they color within the lines of our society?
Oh my gosh. As you're saying this, I was like imagining a presidential candidate campaigning on this platform, and it becomes like a whole shit show. Because, like, let's go back to the China example because I think it illustrates what you're talking about really well. There, in 2014, when they had their government employees wear these neuro headbands, I don't know if they still do this or not. That's why I'm trying to make that distinction between 2014 and now. That's a long
Yeah.
time. But let's say that they do. The motive supposedly was to prevent workplace violence and fatigue, which is very good reasons, right? Because you want to keep workers, especially in a factory setting, safe from fatigue, and nobody wants workplace violence. However, I can totally see the situation where, oh, sir, ma'am, you're tired, we're sending you home. Sir, ma'am, you had an angry thought, we're sending you home. It's like, then it could become like Pavlovian's response, that you train your brain to not have, angry or dissonant, right, thoughts, because no one wants to be sent home from work and presumably not paid. So then in a way, this becomes like a secondary way to mind control, because you're trained through the consequences of your thoughts outwardly, even though you're having the thoughts inwardly.
Yes, that's a big risk of this kind of affect monitoring, is that it will cause people to try to change their affect to, again, fit within the expectations. There's a lot of research, and you mentioned my thesis in my introduction, and I looked at workplace surveillance. And one of the things that we know in looking at workplaces is that it's almost a truism. People perform to the accountabilities that they get rewarded for. So if you're rewarded for never having an angry thought, if you're rewarded for never having a sour expression on your face, there are people who will say this is nonsense and leave, and there are people who really, really try hard to meet those expectations in ways that eventually will fundamentally change who they are. Right now, I mean, in call centers, which is one of the places I did my research, or back a while back when I did my research, because it's a while ago now, a decade or more, one of the things they tell call center workers is smile into the phone, because people can tell from the tone of your voice if you're not smiling. And they would set up a mirror on the side of their desk so that or beside the phone, so that when they reached to pick up the phone, or when they triggered their headset, their phone call came into their headset and they looked up at their screen, they could see their own face and adjust their image accordingly in accordance with organizational policy before they started to talk. That's a low-tech version of the same thing. And you're absolutely right that we already have that impulse. Those in control of productivity of workers, for sure, already have that impulse. And technology that can exacerbate that problem, that can actually get into our minds to affect how we behave and how we're feeling, takes that to a whole other level. But it's entirely in keeping with the, corporate impulse that
Yeah.
we could imagine that actually being a real thing, not just in China. In
No.
China, when it comes to surveillance and intrusive technologies, tends to be a bit of a bugbear, particularly in our democratic Western world. But it's delusional to think that we don't have those exact same impulses.
Oh,
And they are
absolutely.
evidence. They're evidenced by technologies that are all around us right now. Everything from proctoring software for students to make sure they're not looking left or right when they're writing an exam to, there's all kinds of different to the same kind of, to those, those headbands that we're looking at in China, there are companies that are marketing those to consumers and to companies here
Yeah.
in North
Yeah,
America
you can
right
buy
now.
them at that website. That
Yeah.
the brain fingerprinting, it was like, "Would you like to buy our product?" There's a lot happening. The laws are slow. We as humans have not evolved to this point where we're on par with this technology. We're still our primal mammal selves that we have these impulses within ourselves that tell us if we don't conform to the tribe, our lives will be in danger, right? That's kind of the hardware we're still working with, and yet we have this next generation software that is approaching. So how would you suggest that we become wise with all of the smart technology?
It's not an easy answer, but it's an important answer, I think. We need to think about it. We need to, just like if I'm talking to students in a classroom about the idea of consent and protect and good data hygiene, and I say, before you download an app, spend 30 seconds, just 30 seconds, and skim that little pop-up that you get about the terms of service. And if it's a game and if it's asking for access to your camera, spend another 30 seconds and think, why does it need that? And if you can't come up with a good answer in those 30 seconds, don't click yes, because there's guaranteed to be, 50, 60, 100, 1,000 different games that you could play that do much the same thing. So spend the 30 seconds or 60 seconds in your life at the point of making a decision about a technology to think for a minute about what it does and whether you're willing to accept what it does. Shop, vote with your feet, vote with your wallet. And to do those things effectively, use your brain to think through, okay, this is a smart tech that's going to control my thermostat. And that's a good idea because energy is really expensive. And also I care about the planet and I don't want to use more resources than I need to heat my home or cool my home when I'm not there. So I like the concept of this technology. Spend another minute to say, what else does this one do? Does this technology just set the temperature based on a pattern that I give it? Is it monitoring behavior in my space through sensors to automatically adjust the temperature? If it's monitoring behavior in the space automatically, where does that information go? Does it stay on the device so that I benefit from that analysis and nobody else knows about the movements in my home? Or is it calling home? Is it sending back information to the mothership? Is it letting the manufacturer know about movement patterns in my home? Roomba vacuums. There was a big scandal a while back, at least for privacy people, because it turned out that Roombas, when they map out your house in order to do their job of cleaning your floors, were also sending patterns of your house back to the company. And the company argued that was to help them improve the product. And people felt, well, I'm not sure that it was part of the deal when I bought a vacuum cleaner that the layout of my home was going to be exposed. So when it comes to these kinds of technologies, whether it's Nuerotech, right on down to Roomba vacuums, do your due diligence, spend a few minutes thinking, okay, does it do what I want it to do? Cool. Does it do anything I don't want it to do? And if it does stuff I don't want it to do, do I have better options? There are companies out there now, and I spend a lot of time talking to companies to try and tell them, you can compete on privacy. You can compete on ethical behavior. If you are the one out there who has the only option that people don't think is creepy when it comes to the way that you're using their personal information, there will be a consumer base that will go with your product because of that. So my plea to people is make that true. Be the part of the consumer base that votes with your wallet and says, ooh, that one's kind of creepy. I'm going to find something better. And oh, look, this one's better. I'm going to pay for that one. That is really the simplest and most concrete thing we can do.
I think that's really solid advice, and that's something that we can do today. And we don't have to wait for people in charge to change. But as you mentioned before, we definitely need protections about the rights that we value, that we certainly take for granted. Thank you so much for having this chat with me. I know it's a complicated one, it's a hard one, and it's not always a popular one, but I think it's an important one to have. Are there any websites or social outlets that you want to share where people can stay in touch with this topic or stay in touch with your research about this topic?
So for this topic, some of the best places are actually academic research centers, particularly centers where they've got technologists and ethicists working together. One of the very best places is actually at Stanford University, where they have people doing all of those things. And they also take their public education mandate about technology and ethics really seriously. So they have a series of one of the little gifts of the pandemic. When the pandemic started and everyone went to virtual interactions, Stanford opened up a bunch of their activities so that anybody can just go, and if you care about AI ethics and medical technologies, you can go sit for an hour and listen to a Stanford professor who is a medical ethicist talk to a Stanford technologist. So that's one really cool place. In Canada, Queen's University has an amazing group of researchers that are really taking seriously this idea of neurotechnology as it must be coupled with ethics. So those are some, academic-y, but I think important examples of how to stay up to date on reliable, scientifically
Yes,
grounded information
reliable.
about this topic, because there's lots of nonsense out there about this as well. So I always try to give academic examples where it's at least a reputable place. In terms of my work, I am on leave from my job at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, but the CCLA in Canada and our sister organization and friend, the ACLU in the US, tries really hard to be a step ahead of where the law needs to be in thinking through rights implications of these kinds of technologies. So either ccla.org or aclu.org are websites where if you look hard enough, there might be something on this. But again, this neurotech is really new. So you might have to wait a while for it to filter through to that kind of organization.
But those are
So at
helpful.
CCL.
Yeah, those are super helpful. Thank you again so much. I appreciate you. And I know my listeners do too.
Thanks.
Hey, you're still here. Thanks for watching. If you love breaking free from the algorithm to explore curiosity, join me each week by hitting subscribe and the bell for new upload notifications.